You are listening to Our Urban Voices with Dr. Alphonse Javed, a podcast that presents Christian narratives through diverse voices that impact urban ministry. Here is your host.
In this podcast, we cover everything from churches and church planting efforts, mission and missions organization, evangelism, and unreached people groups, emerging movements and initiatives, justice, current events related to faith, and the persecuted church, to author interviews, and more. Let's get to it. Hello, and welcome back to our Urban Voices. I'm your host, Dr. Alphonse Javed. Today, I'm joined by the lead pastor of Redeemer East Harlem in New York City, Justin Adour. Our topic today focuses on approaching social justice issues from a biblical perspective, especially when it comes to evangelical church planting culture that often does not address the historic needs of communities. Before we jump in, a little bit about Justin. Like I said, he is the lead pastor and co-founder of Redeemer East Harlem, a branch of Redeemer Church in New York City, known for his founder, Timothy Keller. He has also served as a youth pastor and staff pastor in the Bronx, chaplain at U.S. Merchant Marine Academy, and a campus minister at NYU. Justin, thank you for being here. Welcome to our show.
Thank you for having me. I'm grateful to be here.
So I just want to hear your thoughts on the subject here. Social justice. Let's start with the social justice aspect, then we'll come to evangelical church planting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the terminology social justice in recent years has become kind of fraught with controversy. I think in large part because of how people define it, and so there's certainly debate out there about is it social justice, or as Christians should we just care about biblical justice, and what's the difference? And I think for me, I probably found myself for a while kind of caught up in trying to articulate those distinctions. Bottom line, I think for me though, is biblical justice, like whatever the Bible means by justice, is going to have social implications. It's going to impact the society in which we live. So however one wants to go about defining it, I'm, happy to play around with some of the definitions. I think for me, of course, my understanding of what justice is, what is right, good, and true, comes from what God says about what is good, right, and true. And so, of course, biblically, the Bible is going to be the primary source of understanding what justice ought to be. But as a result of our engagement of justice, there ought to be social implications. And so when I talk about pursuing justice, that's what I mean, that we ought to see a broad impact.
Would that be the background on why and how you started researching and writing about the need to focus on social justice in church planting? Is that what you consider the background?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think for me, what brought me to our current place has actually been a lot of different experiences that the Lord has allowed us to have over the course of my time in ministry. I think that the background for me is I've found myself in a variety of different places, in a variety of different contexts. So, I mean, just quickly on this point, but, I grew up in a very intercultural home. I grew up in a largely suburban, kind of largely white context. And so there was just kind of those dynamics. So growing up, learning how to navigate some of those dynamics. Fast forward, end up in the city, working in the Bronx. And so there, what I found is that I didn't have a whole lot of time when we were there to be kind of thinking through theological ideas about justice and the historical context of particular communities that are connected to injustices. As a pastor, particularly as a youth pastor up there, I was just always confronted with kind of the crisis or issues of immediacy, things that were going on in the neighborhood, in the community, or with the people that I served. Fast forward again, though, I also found myself in contexts where there really wasn't the same kind of crisis or issues of immediacy. And so as a result of that, there was a lot of theological posturing about what justice is and what it ought to be. But I found that there was a lot of, or there tended to be a lack of like direct involvement in issues of justice, even though there was this theological posturing that was taking place. So that created a bit of a dissonance for me. And I think having those different experiences, and actually, you know, I brought up what it was like kind of going from a Pentecostal context into a more Presbyterian context. That journey as well also created some obviously very different experiences that all kind of culminated in what we started thinking about when we started thinking about church planting. What does it look like to have a robust theology of justice? What does it look like to engage with communities with that you know richness of theology that we had kind of been thinking through? What does it look like to be pulling together different church traditions and the value of those different church traditions into church planting? All of that kind of came to a head for us. So it was a lot of different experiences over the course of ministry that was very much the backdrop to what we're doing now. Mm-hmm.
So before we go any further, I want to make sure we are clear on what several terms mean for our audience. First,
sure.
How do you define racism? And on the flip side, anti-racism?
Yeah. Oh, another fraught question. Yeah, there's been a lot of debate right now about how to define those terms. And I think it's complicated for me. So racism, I guess I'll start there. Racism tends to get defined either one of two ways. Either racism on the one hand, for some is kind of this, it's a individual hatred toward a particular group of people as a result of their race or differences. There's another definition of racism that would say that racism isn't just prejudice against someone or a group of people, but that racism is prejudice plus power, that one has power to actually exert their prejudice on someone else, and that results in injustice. And I got to say, I have sympathy for both of those definitions, because on the one hand, of course, we would all recognize that racism certainly is sinful and is this hatred toward another person as a result of their race. But I would also say we have to recognize that the very concept of race is about centralized power. So as a social construct, what we understand race to be now was something that was created and designed intentionally for the purposes of subjugation. Every culture is going to have its different ways of kind of stumbling into that kind of sin. For us in our American context, the way that we currently have our racial hierarchy set up, it was intentionally set up that way. So there is a power dynamic at play there. So with that in mind, when I think about something like anti-racism and how that overlaps with justice, anti-racism should be an active approach to undermining not only like individual animus that people have and rooting out the sinfulness of that in someone's heart, but also approaching the power structures that have created various inequities as a result of these historic categories being created for the purpose of subjugation. So both of those things for me, I guess, would kind of intersect with how I understand racism and anti-racism.
It's a lot. And I think it needs a further unpacking, which we won't be able to do today, but I do want to encourage folks to look at your writing, and we'll post those links on our website and wherever we post our podcast. I want to make sure people get to hear some of these ideas in depth. But let's move from what to why. So the why part is why importance of justice in church planting, right? So my question to you is, can you explain the importance of a justice orientation to church planting and what justice orientation means? And then second part of that is, why is this so crucial?
Yeah, good question. I think you'd be hard pressed to find Christians that don't agree that justice is required of the Christian. You know, few disagree with that. But I think one of the things that I have found challenging within many church contexts is that the way in which we go about being a just people And by being a just people, I mean not only how we live individually as just people in this world, but how we also corporately live as a just people. Too often, I have found it's just not explicit, and it's not articulated in a way that makes it kind of central to what the church is supposed to be and supposed to do. And I have found that what we don't make explicit in our mission, we often just won't do. And so when I think about justice-oriented churches, there's of course a lot that the church is called to be and do. I do find too often an articulation of justice as part of the church's mission is not there. And so because it's not there, it's not prioritized. And then on top of that, I'd also say, church history has made it pretty clear to us that when justice isn't made explicit and we don't have in front of us what we ought to be doing as people of justice, that we will fall prey to allowing or perpetuating injustice. The church has a long history of doing that. And so because of that, I think it's important that churches articulate their position on justice and what that's going to actually look like for the church. And with a church plants tend to have an easier time to kind of weave some of this into the DNA of their church, of course, because they're new. And it's a lot easier to do that, as you're building up your core team and you're teaching people, the kind of church that you're going to be. This is the kind of thing that can be there. And so when I emphasize justice-oriented church plants, it's kind of a long game. It's the idea of just like, it's with the intention that for the long haul, these are the kinds of churches that I think we should be. And so church planting is a really great way for us to be able to weave it in. That's
cool, man. So I never thought about the importance to focus on the history of a community in a church planting. I think that's interesting that when you're starting out, you gotta, it's kind of like being intentional about building the DNA from the get-go, right? So as you build that core team, people who are working with you, at least the pioneers, they are on board with those essentials that makes a church plant or a church body, a local body. That's neat. So now let me ask you the how part of this. So how to implement it. So can you describe what a church that is focusing on creational restoration and the history of a community is doing? What it looks like?
Again, great question. I think maybe I'll start with that second piece, just the importance of history and understanding a community. My background was, I was an intercultural studies major in my undergrad and did a master's degree in intercultural studies and focusing on missiology. I thought the Lord might be taking us overseas for overseas mission. Instead, he brought us to New York. But one of the key things in missiological studies, I mean, for those that are especially working overseas, contextualization is key, right? So understanding one's context, understanding the culture that one's stepping into is like fundamental to understanding how to best do gospel ministry in that particular context. And so that same principle of in a lot of missiological studies for overseas missions, I think just applies to anywhere where we are on mission. Understanding the history and the culture and what has created that history, what's created that culture within a particular context is crucial to being able to do faithful gospel ministry within a particular context. And so I think it's very important that church planters and church plant core teams have a very good understanding of the context that they're stepping into. That context comes with a history. That context comes with particular joys and sorrows. That context may come with a lot of different historic injustices that have befallen that community. Understanding and knowing all of that, I think, is vital. which then I think leads me to the other piece that you just were mentioning, this idea of creational restoration. If we're going to do gospel ministry, like faithful gospel ministry, we need to have a holistic view of the gospel. And so I think one of the best articulations of the tension that tends to happen within many evangelical circles, Anthony Bradley, who's a professor at King's College here in Manhattan, he wrote an article several years ago. And in that article, he was articulating the tension that many Black Christians have within evangelicalism. And so one of the things that he was noting is that he defined a stream of evangelicalism that emphasized what he called Great Commission Christianity. And for him, Great Commission Christianity is a Christianity that rightly is proclaiming, the need for people to understand their sinfulness and come to a saving knowledge of Christ and being liberated and set free from the bondage of sin, which of course is absolutely right and true. But one of the things that he discusses in that article is that Great Commission Christianity, because it so emphasized the need for individual conversion and revival, that it often didn't actually speak to other facets of the gospel, being that God intends to not just save individual people, but also to restore all of creation. What he describes as the cosmic restoration Christianity is what we should have. And this is very much, of course, Revelation 21, the restoration of all things when Christ returns. And so that's very much still part of the gospel. And so when we're proclaiming the gospel, we are also speaking to that coming day of full restoration. And that, J.I. Packer talks about how the role of the church ought to be that we are making the invisible kingdom of God visible now. That's the role of the church. And so one facet of that is certainly going to be that people would come to a saving knowledge of Jesus, conversion. But another part of what it means to make the invisible kingdom of God visible now is to also point to the full creational restoration that's to come one day. And for me, in the way that I understand what that looks like, that's justice work. It's justice work to see reconciliation within communities, restoration of the various brokenness that exists within a community. All of that is the foundation for justice work. And so our gospel proclamation ought to include those things. And so understanding the context, back to what I was talking about with the history of a community, understanding the history of the community, understanding the brokenness of that community, what has created that brokenness, and then engaging it is gospel ministry. It's justice work, speaking to the restoration that's to come.
So what are the main challenges to approaching a church plant with a justice orientation?
Yeah. A couple of things come to mind. Actually, first and foremost, I think that one of the biggest challenges is just someone internalizing what I just said, that the gospel proclamation of the gospel includes justice work, that it includes a pursuit of seeing communities restored as a way of pointing to that cosmic restoration that's to come. So first and foremost, I'd say that's one place to start. Not everyone, even maybe some of your listeners, may not necessarily agree with what I just said. And so even just being able to wrestle through that, I think that's one challenge. I think the second challenge is that, consumeristic Christianity that often seeks to take and not give, this rubs up against that quite a bit, because in order to be a people of justice, to be churches that are churches of justice, it does require giving a lot. Like it's a lot of input into the community. So pushing against consumeristic Christianity, that's, a Christianity that cares a lot about, programs are good, but only cares about programs, or only cares about really high quality worship services, and doesn't give much attention to how do we go out and actually proclaim gospel in the way that we are living and existing in a community. I think the other challenges is, once you get past some of those dynamics on the ground, earning the trust of the community is a lot of work. It takes a prioritization of time and energy to build those relationships within the community so that people actually trust the work that you're doing. And that time will inevitably take away from time and resources that might be spent elsewhere. And so that's another big challenge. It just takes a lot of time and effort and work and longevity within the community to engage well.
And as a pastor, and especially if you are solo pastor, then it's harder. And New York City has many solo pastors, especially ethnic pastors. When I say ethnic, I mean by that I mean members of minority groups, especially coming from overseas, whether Bangladeshi, Pakistani, you name it. So they work in the mornings, and in the evenings they do their visitation, and on Sundays they meet. So for those kind of pastors, because they're also hit by the same issues, and it's hard to give time. They have very limited time and very limited resources. Thank you for sharing these challenges. I think knowing and understanding these challenges help people to go into the work of justice-oriented church plant with some, at least with some expectation, okay, this is what we need to do in order to change the culture or have an impact in this ever-changing city of New York. But let me take you back in 2020. During the social justice movement in 2020, you encouraged members of your congregation to participate in 1 to 2 marches and at least 1 prayer vigil. In fact, actually, one of the marches in East Harlem ended in a time of prayer, and the then mayor de Blasio attended and allowed the group to pray for him. So here's the question: why was it important for you personally, as a believer, an individual, but also a pastor, and for your congregation to participate in marches or prayer vigils?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind for me is that, we do live in a particular culture and society that allows for that kind of gathering. And I think there's, much like I would encourage Christians to vote because it's the way in which we're able to make our voice known in our particular context. I would say the same thing is, for something like this. Like we have the opportunity to do so. It's a privilege for us to be able to, engage things like vigils or protests even. And so I think it's valuable for us to utilize that kind of gift that we have within our society. But the second thing to that would also just be, it's one of the ways that we are able to stand in solidarity with others in the community that care about the same kinds of things. One of the things that we did is, all of the marches that we encouraged our church to be part of, they were all prayer oriented. Or, you mentioned vigils. I attend a lot of vigils. Of course, those prayer vigils are often just that. They're opportunities to pray together. And so being able to link arms with other congregations, other pastors, there is that sense of solidarity and partnership. That is crucial to building that trust that I was talking about earlier. It's crucial to actually being able to see real societal change. No one church is ever going to be able to make the kind of impact on a community that needs to be, that needs to happen. And so when we're able to link arms with one another, we're better together than we are separately. And so just pragmatically being part of those kinds of things together helps get stuff done. In addition, the last thing I'd say is I actually think it's a beautiful witness to a watching world when Christians who may come from different, streams of Christianity, they look different, their services are different, there's differences amongst them, and yet they are able to come together and work together. I think it's a testament, especially in these divided times, of what unity ought to look like. And I'd say there's probably, one of the greatest testaments of the Spirit of God working within any particular context is the people of God joining together in unity. And so I think it's a real testament to the world, and I think that's valuable. Yep.
So Justin, you clearly said in your statement, as you started responding to my question, there's value in these protests, right? So let me ask you this: what was the response from your congregation like And did you make a distinction between prayer, vigil, marches, and protests?
Yeah, we did make a distinction whenever we promoted doing something together as a church. I mean, we certainly have people, and I'll just even be frank, even for me, who certainly attended other things that might not have been specifically prayer oriented. But as a church, that was very important for us because, again, we're wanting to be part of something in unity with other brothers and sisters in our community. So we did make that distinction. I don't know that I would encourage just randomly go find a protest and join it. Having a good sense of what the goals of that protest are, I think are important. And so we made that distinction for sure. And then as far as the response goes, we had a lot of people come and show up. And I think that the prayer orientation allows us to have people join who might not be fully aligned with everything that's happening, but because we're emphasizing prayer, that's a very unifying kind of thing. And so we try to keep things as we don't want to be divisive. And so we try to minimize divisiveness that might happen and instead focus on praying together. And so because of that, I think we had a pretty good response overall from our congregation as a result. Yeah.
That's awesome, brother. This is really cool. So just switching gear a little bit, we talked previously about privileged mobility with another guest on the show, Shirley Anand from Spark of Justice at Bethel Gospel Assembly, and how Christian urban transplants, especially believers, need to be mindful that there is a privilege in having somewhere else to go back home to. Unlike transplants, lifelong residents of a city like New York City are already at home. If there are problems in the community, they cannot leave as readily and start over somewhere else. What does this mean for a church in an urban setting? I'm talking about your church.
Yeah.
How you see it.
For me, this is one of the challenges, especially in, I think Manhattan, a lot of neighborhoods in the city experience this. In Manhattan, of course, Manhattan is a churning of people. There are always people coming and going, and they're always coming and going for a variety of different reasons. And this very much overlaps for me the importance of understanding history and context, because the notion of privileged mobility, as you just said, is the privilege one has to be able to come into particular contexts of their own volition, and then for a variety of different reasons decide to leave. Not everyone has that kind of agency in life. And so for me, one of the reasons why within our church plant, we spent time on this idea of privileged mobility is because there may be a variety of different reasons that bring one in and out of the city. And I don't by no means want to judge those, because there really are a lot of valid reasons why someone may come and go. But I think one of the things that I want to push back against that tends to happen with people that have privileged mobility is that the neighborhood becomes something that they use as opposed to loving and caring for and investing in. And so one of the things that I'd really love for people and church plants to be encouraging with their people, especially if they're in neighborhoods that are gentrifying neighborhoods or neighborhoods that see a lot of turnover, is to really be discipling people toward paying very close attention to the neighborhood that they live in. And as a result, honoring that neighborhood for however long you're there, by investing in and loving that community. And that might look very different depending on the person and depending on the amount of time that one has in that community. But resisting privileged mobility for me looks like, one, if you don't have to just go, then don't go. Root yourself, don't utilize your privilege. But second, if you do have to go, then whatever that time that you have there, to love well, to serve well, to be involved as much as possible, because your neighbors, the people that you're literally living next door to, they're not going to have the same kind of privilege that you have. And it communicates something really problematic. Here's probably my biggest concern. When Christians come and go that way, it communicates to the neighborhood and the people of that neighborhood, implicitly, maybe even sometimes explicitly, that I don't really care about you. I don't really care about what's going on in your life or in your world. I just need to use your neighborhood for a little while until, whatever, I get my job promotion or I get that raise and I can get out of here and move to another neighborhood. It communicates the wrong kinds of things that really does undermine faithful gospel witness and ministry. And so I'd encourage people to push back against that privileged mobility by loving and caring about their neighborhoods for as long as they're there.
Right. And I think there is this built-in trust. You gotta earn that trust to even speak into those lives, because things like privileged mobility, it could be divisive if you don't have invested trust and love, and if the person doesn't know you well, it could be one of those things that can create problem for a church. And again, it goes back to what you said earlier, when you are building your core group, when you have that in your DNA, hopefully it starts there, because the longer by and large, the churches that end up resisting or fighting back to that kind of notion are the churches that have been around for a very, very, very long time. They have seen only what it was 140 years ago, 170 years ago, 175 years ago. So they don't see the problem. They just see that, well, we are all about inclusion. We are, even those who believe in the doctrinal truths and stand on the unity and all of that good stuff, they tend to kind of like not complacent, but tend to be like a little less mobile when it comes to things like this, because they feel that, well, we are not the ones who reject membership or do not allow people to come in. But I think what we are talking about is going beyond that. That's good. It's nice. Yes, continue to do that, but do more. And I think that's very intentional. It takes even almost like re-educating our pastors, and probably that's why I'm talking to you, Justin. And part of that is we are the new breed of pastors, right? Who have the privilege of leading churches, and because we had the privilege to go to Bible school and seminaries in a time when people have different view of race, justice, and all of it. So we are like, I think that's shaping our worldview, not the biblical worldview that is based on the Bible, but what we're experiencing, the practicality of that, practically what's happening and how it relates to that. I think it's something that's going to take some time. It's not going to happen overnight, and that's why we got to constantly talk about that. So as we close, we are heading toward closing this episode. So how could someone listening, either a pastor or a church goer, take action on social justice? And again, audience, I want to make sure that I know that within the church, we have very clear distinction on what is social justice. And of course, as Justin has already made very clear, that we are talking about the biblical justice. And that's what we standing for, and that's what we are advocating. So when I'm saying social justice, that's what we are referring to. So let me go back. So how could someone listening, either a pastor or a church goer, take action on biblical justice, social justice, and what's step number one?
Step number one for me is solidifying the conviction that it matters. Again, back to what I said earlier, internalizing it is crucial, because if it's not internalized in the leader, in the core team, or whatever the context might be, if the church planter or leaders within a particular congregation, if it's not internalized as a conviction, then it's kind of, that ends up being kind of a non-starter. So taking the time to really consider biblically what justice ought to look like, consider the conviction that a cosmic restoration is part of the gospel proclamation, and that means being involved in proclaiming the restoration that's to come. So internalizing that, I think, is step number one. Step number two, I think, is just, again, really getting to know the context, and then just start getting involved. When we start talking about social justice conceptually, I think sometimes people can get very overwhelmed by what it means to start getting involved. And there's all kinds of, what organization should I affiliate with, or what issues, political issues should I get involved in or not get involved in? It gets very overwhelming. And there may come a time to have to do those kinds of things, but starting locally, I think, is so important. Just pay attention to what's happening in the neighborhood, and show up to community board meetings, join any kind of newsletters or communications that are updating people about what's happening in the community, and then start getting involved in that way. And from there, I think then the Lord just starts opening up the doors and providing the wisdom for congregations to know how to take the next steps. But those are some really good, easy places to start local. Yep.
Awesome, Justin. So Justin, what I'm hearing is, I'm trying to internalize what you're saying. So the first thing is internalize, right? What it means and what it is. And then secondly, be intentional to engage your community and be in the community. Whatever is happening, just be there.
Yep.
Okay, so anything else you like to add to this conversation?
No, I think, maybe my only encouragement would be, like you had started off with, my heart has been not only for our congregation, but even beyond with church plants and, revitalizations. You had mentioned as part of my dissertation work, just the notion of churches trying to reimagine what their involvement in this kind of issue will be like. My encouragement would just be that this is it's going to be a really vital part of our ongoing work as Christians and as churches into the future. It always should have been. It hasn't always been the way that it needed to have been, but it's going to be very important for the witness of the church going forward. I think in too many places, the church is not known for both biblical fidelity and staying true to the word of God, and also being advocates of justice, social justice, biblical justice, whatever you want to call it, being advocates for it. And so again, with a world that's watching, I think this is the way evangelism looks going into the future, making that kind of proclamation to the world that's watching. Yeah.
So Justin, if listeners want to get in touch with you, what are the easiest ways?
The thing I'd probably most encourage people to do is to go to untilzion.com. At Until Zion is, along with my friend and colleague Abe Cho, we've been doing a lot of writing there, posting articles on a lot of these kinds of topics. And so it's probably the quickest and easiest way to read more on some of the things that we're thinking about in this arena, and then also to get in touch with me as well.
So folks, we'll make sure that that's included in the episode description. Well, as we close this time, because we talk about heavy topics, and there was a lot of knowledge and a lot of practical advice, I'd like to ask you to tell me a joke. So, yeah.
Joke. Yeah. What comes? So this is a dad joke. My wife.
I love
my wife
dad
told
jokes,
me.
Man.
Yeah.
I have 4 children. How many you got? Remind me again.
I have 2 daughters. Yeah. I have 2 daughters. Yeah.
That's awesome, man.
Yeah. This is from my wife. So can't even take full credit, but I think New Yorkers will appreciate it in particular. What kind of bagel can fly?
What kind?
A plain bagel.
That's good, man. No, I love it. That's good. Very good. That is a dad joke. You're right.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for being on the show again, Justin. And Justin is lead pastor of Redeemer East Harlem in New York City. Thank you to all of our listeners. If you appreciate this episode, this podcast, please be sure to subscribe to the show and leave an honest review wherever you listen to your podcast.
Thanks for having me, brother.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Our Urban Voices with Dr. Alphonse Javed, which presents Christian narratives through diverse voices that impact urban ministry. Please check back for new episodes every week.